Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Library, and if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and I do a book review a week, mixing up a cocktail while I review it. I call it Books and Booze. This month I am reading ancient history, but this week's book is a spin on ancient Egypt. It is Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of the Ancients by John Anthony West. The accompanying cocktail is Serpent's Kiss. It is equal parts melon liqueur, coconut rum, raspberry liqueur, and pineapple juice. So let's do this. It's mixed in the glass, so I have my glass here and my spoon already in the glass. Melon liqueur. So Serpent in the Sky is a brief synopsis of the works of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'll put the spelling up here, though, so you guys can see and look it up for yourself. I think he was French. I mean, his books were written in French, so I'm kind of assuming he was French, but he might not have been. He was an Egyptologist, though, and he wrote Le Temple de l'Homme, which translates as the Temple of Man. The entire premise of this book, Serpent in the Sky, and thus Lubitz's work, is that the monuments in Egypt were built well before the pharaonic dynasties. The pharaohs merely inherited them. Which is a really interesting premise. So those monuments include, of course, the pyramids, obviously the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, the temple complex at the Sphinx, also known as the Temple of Man. De Lubitz is the originator of the idea that water is responsible for the erosion of the Sphinx, not wind or sand, which was the long-standing premise, and we will come back to that idea near the end of this review. It's not a very long book. It was like 240 pages, I think, and it opens with Pythagoras, believe it or not. And now I know Pythagoras is Greek, not Egyptian. That's like kind of what the point that West was going for. Greece is basically credited with the creation of Western civilization. West is arguing that all the pieces of Western civilization existed well before Pythagoras was even a thought, and those pieces are found in Egypt. This is not an easy jar to hold. It's a nifty looking jar, but it's not an easy jar to hold. This looks absolutely vile right now. It's kind of this weird green-red mix. Yeah, I got the rum in there, right? Yes, I got the rum in there. God, I hope I got the rum in there. We're gonna find out. Ooh. Ah! Oh, I spilled a little pineapple on my counter. Actually, I had to go back and make sure I poured the rum in there. I don't want to forget such a key part. This gets stirred, so let me stir this up. Well, I mean, it looks revolting. It's this sickly brown color that just... So anyways, where was I at? I was with Pythagoras, right? So West is arguing that all the pieces of Western civilization existed well before Pythagoras was even a thought, and those pieces are found in Egypt. And, I mean, he has a point. I mean, Pythagoras lived roughly 570 to 495 BCE, and while there is clearly some debate about the age of the Sphinx and the pyramids, no one would dispute that at a bare minimum they were around as early as the pharaoh Khafre, aka Khepron, who lived and reigned around 2570 BCE, so about 2,000 years before Pythagoras. So these monuments existed well before him, and West, de Lubitz, are making the argument that all of Pythagorean math and all math that comes after it was well known to the Egyptians. And so Western civilization gets its start in Egypt. And there's actually some solid basis for that. I feel like I saw fairly recently, and I'll see if I can locate it and throw a picture or a link up or something, about the Pythagorean theorem existing in Babylon, which predates even Egypt. Or maybe it was Mesopotamia. I don't know. I'll see if I can, jog the memory out of my, semi-pickled brain and let you guys know. And because that would certainly add a little more fuel to the fire, wouldn't it, over who came first, Pythagoras or Egypt? Well, okay, we know Egypt came first. But he's saying the math is not original to Pythagoras. It originated in Egypt. We should give all credit where it's due, which I agree. Oh, that is a very sweet cocktail. I don't necessarily have anything against sweet, but that is a sweet cocktail. Whew. Wow. Mostly it just tastes like sugar. If you want a sugar water that's going to fuck you up, may I recommend the Serpent's Kiss. Whew. Now, West does provide some interesting points about the very specific layouts of the monuments of Egypt. And of course, he raises all the usual questions of how were these so-called primitives able to move, 200-ton stone blocks when we can't even do it these days, right? I think I discussed that in Graham Hancock's book. There's like 2 cranes on planet Earth today that could do it. How the hell did they manage to do it 2,000 years before, before Common Era? Given that modern thought has it the civilization more or less starts with the Greeks, the precision of the monuments specifically calls that belief into question. One of the more interesting aspects of this book are the footnotes. Although they're not technically footnotes, they're more like sidebars that are heavy excerpts from other books, some of which are used to support the central theme, some of which are like the opposing points of view. The supporting excerpts are pulled from many different fields, incidentally including math, medical, geodesy, art, architecture, all of these different fields, geography, geology, these are pulled into these sidebars and kind of used to bolster the case that these other fields all recognize that there's more going on to Egypt. The only ones who dispute it are the Egyptologists, and they kind of have their egos in the way there, which I buy it. Ego does more damage to the planet Earth than anything else on this planet does. West builds a narrative using Delubich's work about how advanced Egypt was and well before Khafre came on the scene. He points out many reasons that civilization started way before Khafre, and that it's most likely that Khafre simply restored the Sphinx but did not actually build it. And he lays a solid groundwork for this belief, and argues that a far more advanced civilization that vanished at some point was replaced by the pharaohs, whose task was to restore and preserve what was left behind. Now, a lot of this book, especially the early chapters, go into sacred geometry, and now I'm fine with the sacred part. I'm a witch. We kind of live in the liminal places of sacredness, right? Geometry and I have had a cordial dislike for each other since about the 6th grade. And we nod at each other in passing, and we, politely avert our eyes from each other. So when he's talking about the math portions of it, my eyes kind of glazed over a little bit. But my interest perked right back up again once we got past the math parts and West starts digging into like the medicine used. I mean, especially as ever so slowly East meets West in the medical fields, and things like acupuncture, massage therapy are acknowledged by Western doctors to be highly beneficial. His discussion of the Sphinx and the erosion patterns was particularly interesting, and this is kind of what sparked Dr. Schock's interest in the matter as well. And even without reading Schock's specific water erosion conclusions, West does an outstanding job explaining why sand and wind erosion is unlikely. Namely that for large periods of time, the Sphinx was buried under the sands of Egypt. So erosion, by its very nature, requires movement across surfaces. It's the difference between placing a piece of sandpaper grit side down on a piece of wood, and it just kind of sits there, but it does nothing because it's just sitting there. But it's the motion, the back and forth motion, that erodes and smooths that plank of wood. Well, you have to have some sort of motion. If the Sphinx is buried under sand, there's no motion to cause the erosion. If the Sphinx was buried, erosion simply couldn't have happened. And we know that it was buried for enormous chunks of time because when Napoleon worked his way to Egypt, the Sphinx was buried up to its neck. They have photographs, and well, not photographs because this was slightly before photography, but very accurate drawings of what it looked like when the French armies rolled into Egypt. He includes some of those line drawings in his book, and they're very detailed. And you have the pyramids, and you have the Sphinx literally buried up to, I just touched my microphone, literally buried up to its neck. All you can see is its little head. It looks like a little disembodied head just floating on the sand there. So we know it was buried, and we know that that burial happened over thousands of years. So if it was buried, how did it erode? Well, the erosion happened well before it was buried, and he, of course, argues for heavy rainstorms. Actually, he argued for flooding, like Nile flooding, and then Schock came in and said, no, it can't have been flooding. It has to have been erosion from rainfall, and here's why. And he agrees with that. Again, he that is the difference between somebody who's a zealot and somebody who actually sees reason. Is a zealot is going to stick with their idea regardless of the evidence, of presentation of new evidence to the contrary. And there were a host of other reasons provided as to why wind and sand were unlikely culprits in the erosion. One of the appendices does address Schock contributions briefly. It mentions many other geologists who actually agree that water erosion was the source of the damage. including one of West's most vigorous critics. However, that critic, and I don't recall his name, it's Lebitz something, started with an L, not DeLubitz, it's something else, or maybe it started with an F. Oh crap, I might look it up. You know what, let's look it up. Who was the critic? It's right near the end. It shouldn't be that hard to find. Dun, dun, dun. Lerner, started with an L. God, I was way off. Lerner, Lehner, is the last name. But him and another Egyptologist, I think it was an Egyptologist, maybe it was another geologist, I don't know. They hypothesized that it was groundwater. Groundwater seeped up and caused the erosion from underneath. Not a geologist here, obviously. Said that multiple times. Actually, I don't think I've ever claimed to not be a geologist, but I'm claiming here I am not a geologist. But even without West's careful decimation of that hypothesis, like, my bullshit meter went off. I live in a desert, right? High desert Nevada. In a desert environment, groundwater would have to struggle awfully hard to erode anything. And honestly, if groundwater existed at the degree needed to cause erosion, anything capable of growing in that temple compound would have sprung up and pulled the water into its own roots, thus away from the temple. And we know things can grow in Egypt. I mean, look at the Nile. It's not just a muddy flow of water. Things grow up along the Nile. In fact, that's pretty much the only place where things grow is in the Nile. So lots of things grow in the Nile. The Sphinx is not that far from the Nile. So anything capable of growing would have certainly done so if groundwater had seeped up enough to allow it to happen. Anyway, this book covers a lot of ground, from sacred geometry to symbolic language. It raises a lot of questions that have yet to be answered. I especially enjoyed his discussion of translation problems, and where he says that hieroglyphs need to not just be translated but interpreted. And there is a very key difference, because a translation would just be a straight for straight word, right? Like Le Temple de l'Homme, the temple of the man, basically, is what that translates as, straight to straight, right? If you want a good example of, like a really recent example of interpretation versus translation, watch Shogun, the recently released Shogun, because in that the Japanese parts are all in Japanese, so it's not just like the all in English and the white guy stands there and pretends like he doesn't understand what's being said. They actually did a very credible job with it. It was actually a really amazing screenplay on it. But Mariko sits there, and when the English guy, whatever the hell his name is, well, the English guy, I remember her name, Mariko, the lady Mariko. I don't want to go into spoilers in case you haven't read the book, but he's like, oh, translate for me. And she doesn't just translate word for word what he said to the Japanese lord. She interprets it into acceptable Japanese society, so that instead of being given dictates, it's a very polite, please, Lord, will you do this? Don't do that. Or this is why I don't think you should do that. So that's the difference between a straight translation, this is what he said directly, versus interpreting it into something that's societally acceptable and makes sense within the context of that society. Well, that's what he's saying we need to do with the hieroglyphs. You don't just translate it word for word. Does it make sense? Does the translation make sense? And he points out many different translations, none of which make sense, and said this is why we need symbology. This will help us to interpret it, not just translate it. And I can wrap my head around that. He kind of goes into, at that point, how there are, that's what I'm looking for, many amateur Egyptologists who have taught themselves hieroglyphs that come up with credible translations which will never see the light of day because they're not approved academically, meaning they didn't get their knowledge of hieroglyphs through academic channels, i.e. universities, and so they are treated as less than. Well, this book was written in the early 1990s, and that emphasis on credentialing is rapidly losing its validity. Again, to repeat the point, experts are losing their credibility through fanaticism to the Church of Progress, as West calls it, which I absolutely love that phrase. It's the Church of Progress. The Church of Progress gave us, social distancing and stupid little cloth masks that stop nothing, not even air. Now, for all that I learned a lot and I quite enjoyed this book, it was a mixed bag for me. I enjoyed the premise. I enjoy things that make my mind spin and wonder what could have been and what the past was. There's that belief that if the library library at Alexandria had not been burned, then we might all have colonized Mars by now, right? The math parts, I mean, I know the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I know the speed of gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. I know that pi is 3.1415, and phi, the golden ratio, which is discussed quite frequently in this book, is 1.618. That sums up my knowledge of math. Like that's it. That's what I know. That's all I know about math. I will say this is like a highly condensed version of West's documentary series Magical Egypt. And if you struggle with math the way I do, Magical Egypt is a little bit easier to digest. But there's good information in here. Information that I said, it makes me think about the far distant past. I mean, so far distant that it likely predates Göbekli Tepe, and about which we will probably never know more than the monuments that were left behind. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.